This video is going to be talking about some of the domestic affairs that are occurring during the Cold War. Realize that by the end of the Second World War, Americans are getting really tired of making sacrifices during the war. Remember that they're rationing, right? So there is this desire to sort of return to a normal economic state towards the end of the Second World War. But what we have at first, after the war is over, is a spread of inflation. You can see here. I know that this graph is way more than just the Cold War period, but 1945 is when the war officially ends. And just look at this spike in the inflation rate shortly after the war. I know it's going to go down, and we'll talk about why that is. But basically, at first, the post-war economy is sort of is in a very bad place. In addition to that, you're going to have a lot of workers' strikes. So Truman is going to try to take an active stance to help fix some of these economic problems. And so he urges Congress to continue controlling prices. He really wants prices to maintain sort of at the wartime level because he wants to hold inflation in check. But we're going to see that Congress is not going to go along with this plan. We're going to have the Republicans in Congress team up with Southern Democrats, and they're actually going to relax the controls of the Office of Price Administration. So basically what this means is that there's no longer going to be any sort of government oversight to control prices in the market, and this is going to make inflation surge. So it's going to go up about 25% in the first year and a half after the war. And like I was saying before, you have a lot of strikers. In 1946 alone, over 4.5 million workers go on strikes. There's going to be a lot of strikes by railroad and mine workers, and this is going to threaten national safety. But Truman proves to take a really tough approach on these strikers. He actually seizes mines. He uses soldiers to keep them operating until the United Mine Workers finally call off the strike. So he is going to work to, attempt to control some of this post-war economic trouble. But really what we see is that one of the biggest problems in the post-war economy is that Truman and Congress are not working in tandem to try to solve these problems. So Truman's plan to fix the economy was one of reconversion. He wanted to reconvert the U.S. economy from wartime to peacetime. And one of the measures that he tries to take to do that is through the Employment Act of 1946. And so Truman wanted to use this act to adopt national health insurance. He wanted to increase minimum wage, and he also wanted to pass a bill to commit the U.S. government to full-time employment. So in a lot of ways, we see that this is sort of a continuation of New Deal policies. But again, he's getting a lot of pushback from the Republicans and the Southern Democrats in Congress. So they do pass the Employment Act, but it's very watered down. The Employment Act does create something called a Council of Economic Advisors. This is meant to counsel both the president and Congress on how to promote national economic welfare, but Truman doesn't get a lot of these major programs like national health insurance and such. The major accomplishment of the Employment Act of 1946 is that we raise minimum wage, but a lot of the other provisions he wanted do not go through. So the Council of Economic Affairs that does result from the Employment Act is that it works to try to improve job rates, to try to improve production, and try to increase purchasing power, but there wasn't enough funding behind this council, so it's not particularly effective. Arguably, Truman has a much better reputation in his efforts to improve the situation for people of color in the United States. And so, again, he is getting pushback, especially from Southern Democrats who tend to be anti-civil rights, but still he actually bypasses Southern Democrats who are controlling key committees in Congress, and he uses instead his executive powers to establish a committee called the Committee on Civil Rights, and he does this in 1946. And so what this committee does is, A, it strengthens the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, and then he goes ahead in 1948 to end racial segregation in the armed forces. And this is really major because, as we know, ever since the Emancipation Proclamation and the Civil War, the U.S. forces were segregated. This resulted in a lot of disillusionment among the African American community fighting in the armed forces. They thought that signing up and fighting for their country would bring them more equality, but it did not. And also, as we see in an instance like World War I, it made them sort of realize that racism was a greater problem in the United States than it was abroad. So by ending racial segregation, this is a major step towards more equality. And what this means is that the Korean War is going to be the first American conflict where the armed forces is integrated racially. Truman also attempts to establish a Fair Employment Practices Commission, and what this would have done was prevent employers from discriminating against the hiring of African Americans. But again, Southern Democrats blocked this legislation. So in 1946, these are midterm elections. We do start to see that there's going to be a major attempt by Republicans in Congress in particular to undo a lot of the remaining programs that resemble the New Deal. In 1946, Republicans gain control of Congress, and they start to undo a lot of New Deal programs. And so, for example, Congress attempts to pass 2 tax cuts for upper-income Americans. As we know, this definitely goes against New Deal policies. Truman does veto both of these measures, however. But Congress does actually get the 22nd Amendment ratified. And what this does is it limits presidential terms. You can only serve 2 consecutive terms in office now. And in a lot of ways, this was a reaction to FDR's presidency, where he was in the middle of his 4th term when he dies, right? So again, this is passed by a Republican-dominated Congress that really wants to ensure that no one person can become too powerful in an executive capacity. After after the Republicans gain the majority in Congress, they're able to pass the Taft-Hartley bill. This is passed over Truman's veto, and what this does is it severely limits the powers of unions. Truman does, unions as well, but Truman really tries to push to repeal the Taft-Hartley bill, but he's not successful. So we start to see that by 1946, a lot of these New Deal type programs are going away. By 1948, we are going to see that on the one hand, there are going to be a lot of voters that are not satisfied with Truman's performance. This is in the midst of the Korean War, for example. So there are certainly people that are dissatisfied with what's taking place there. We do also have a third-party candidate. His name is Henry Wallace. He was Truman's Secretary of Commerce, but he got fired. And so then he runs as a third-party candidate on the progressive ticket. And this is going to be supported by a lot of liberal Democrats. But Henry Wallace's campaign is not successful because his enemies use what's called red baiting. Basically, they accuse him of being a communist, and so this makes his political run not very successful. Then you have another party emerge. Conservative Democrats break off, and they form what's called the States' Rights Party. It's nicknamed the Dixiecrats. And what they do is they choose Strom Thurmond as their candidate, and Strom Thurmond was anti-civil rights. So at this point, we're seeing sort of a division in the Democratic Party. The more traditional Southern Democrats are very against Truman's provisions for civil rights. And so you do see that Strom Thurmond does pick up a number of states in the South. But it's not enough effectively to defeat Truman in the election, right? So what Truman does is he tries to reposition himself a little farther to the left, so you could say that Henry Wallace is influencing Truman's platform. He warns voters that if a Republican candidate were elected, that the U.S. would be more bound towards Wall Street. So Truman does manage to hang on to the old New Deal coalition, the people who supported Truman's plans for having a much greater involvement in providing for the welfare of American citizens. Truman also promises sort of a peacetime version of the New Deal. He calls it the Fair Deal. And this gets him a lot of votes because he's promising for more subsidized education, housing, etc. And also his campaign is one that really blasts the other party. The Give Him Hell, Harry campaign right? So basically, he tries to remind the voters that it was the Republican Party that was in control when the U.S. sank into depression, and this is pretty successful, right? And also remember that in 1948, that's when the Berlin airlift was taking place, and this was seen as very successful. And so this is enough to get Truman reelected in 1948. And when he is reelected, he attempts to establish this Fair Deal program, like we were saying. In a lot of ways, this is an extension of the New Deal into the post-war era. So what Truman does is he's urging Congress to enact national health care insurance, to provide federal aid for education, to provide more civil rights legislation, to provide funds for public housing, and also to continue to provide farmers with some relief. But at this point, again, remember that there was a majority of Republicans in Congress, so conservatives block most of these proposed reforms. And the only thing that they accomplish is that they do increase minimum wage and they do include more workers under Social Security. But other than that, most of the Fair Deal programs are not successful. Truman conflicts with Republicans in Congress quite a bit. He's also pressing foreign policy of the Cold War, and so a lot of people make the argument that his foreign policy sort of trumped domestic policy concerns, which is another reason why most of the Fair Deal programs do not end up going through. But the few accomplishments that he makes under the Fair Deal were praised by liberals. They make the argument that he is maintaining some of the New Deal goals of his predecessors, and also since he makes civil rights a priority, this means that minorities are still very much in support of Truman. And so as we know at this point, this is, you saw a major conversion of a lot of people of color migrating towards the Democratic Party, starting with FDR. This trend continues because of Truman's contributions to civil rights. All right, so that's the general gist of Cold War domestic policy. The last video that we're going to do is more on Cold War culture, but we're also going to talk about the McCarthy era in there. So stay tuned for that.